But think about it, in human history, or through most of human history, money was essentially gold or silver. You know, wherever the trading public was free to choose around the world in all societies and cultures, they ended up taking the precious metals as a form of money. But there were always periods, or for the last sort of 900 years, we had various experiments with paper money. The first ones in China, 900 years ago, there were 4 Chinese dynasties that issued paper money. And again, the state issued paper money, insisted that it's being used and circulated. And the first paper money systems in the Western world we had from the late 17th century in the British colonies in America. Massachusetts was one of the first colonies to issue paper money, and then the first famous experiments in France under John Law in 1716. Now, to make a long story short, all these systems failed. So paper money was always introduced by the state. It ultimately always ended in failure. And the failure always came in one of 2 ways. Either inflation, I mean, inflation always rose under the paper money system. Money was always debased, you know, and it led to various economic problems. So either monetary authorities voluntarily stopped printing paper money and went back to a gold standard or a commodity money form, or they missed that point. Inflation spun out of control, the public lost confidence in money, and you had a complete monetary breakdown and huge economic collapse and social chaos. So the point is, all paper money systems are introduced by the state and through politics. So far in history, none of them survived. The pound, obviously, pound and US dollar are today the 2 oldest currencies in use. And it's interesting, the pound also was intermittently off gold and silver. I mean, famously between 1797 and 1821, again, a decision of politics, usually paper money is being issued or the link to gold is being severed whenever the state needs money. In 1797, William Pitt needed money to fund the war against France. So he told the Bank of England to no longer exchange gold, the paper notes for gold, take, you know, the pound off gold and start printing money. And back then, politicians didn't even make any pretenses. You know, it was the introduction of paper money was a tool to fund the state, usually wars or revolutions. And so the pound was intermittently, but then in 1821 went back to gold. The US dollar was off gold, for example, during the Civil War. Again, a war, the state needed money, printing paper money, the greenback was issued, but in 1879 the United States went back, joined Britain on the gold standard, and this was sort of the period of the classical gold standard from 1879 to 1914. The whole thing collapsed in 1914 because Germany left the gold standard to fund the First World War. So my point here is these are political constructs. They've always failed. So we have every right to be suspicious of such a monetary system. And please remember that the monetary system we have now, our current fiat money system, is only 40 years old. I mean, as Steve said, it was on the 15th of August 1971 that Richard Nixon closed the gold window. After the Second World War, the dollar had become the global reserve currency, but central banks around the world had a promise from the US government that they could exchange their paper dollars for physical gold at a fixed price of $35 an ounce. And they could take delivery of physical gold. And again, my point here is the important thing here was not so much that it was gold, the important thing was that this was limited the ability of the US government to print money. And it therefore also contained, you know, its fiscal policy. It could not run large deficits, and it could not flood the markets with cheap money. So in 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window. It's very interesting. If you go back to that point, I find it interesting today if you challenge our paper money system, and people immediately say, like, well, you know, you mean a gold standard would be better, but a gold standard failed, and it means deflation, and it means economic hardship, and we lose monetary policy, we can't stimulate the economy. All these arguments that you hear today that supposedly why our system today is better. It's very interesting that in 1971, Nixon didn't quote any of these arguments, because it was simply, as usual, purely political expediency. In fact, Richard Nixon got on national TV on August 1971, and I think you can probably still find the clip on YouTube, and told the American public that this was only temporary. You know, this was just because to fight off evil speculation against the US dollar. Now we know that this was This is now 41 years ago, so and there's so far no effort to go back on gold. And obviously, in those 41 years, the dollar has lost more purchasing power than at any other period through its 200 or almost 300-year period, even more than at other times when it was off gold. In fact, the dollar since 1971 has lost about 75% of its then purchasing power. So prices have gone up so much. The pound sterling has done even worse. The pound has lost about 90% of its purchasing power from where it was in 1971.